going to show you exactly how much I spend when I restore a boat, because I actually ended up smashing my finger here with a dead blow. So since I'm pretty much out of commission with this, and I've got like 3 or 4 projects going on, but this stops me from being able to work on those boats. So let's go over exactly what I spend when I restore a boat. Well, looks like it's not. This is a 1992 23-foot Ocean Master with a 300 horsepower Mercury Verado. Now, most of the boats that I've done, I've found them all in a similar fashion, where I kind of look for a distressed boat that needs a lot of work. And for this particular boat that we're talking about, I actually got it. What I paid for the boat was $1,000. And I paid $1,000 for it because obviously it needed all these things. It needed the fuel tank, needed a transom, all the electronics were shot, needed the T-top cleaned up. Basically, the boat went through Hurricane Irma on a rack, and it was just trashed. And then it sat around for probably maybe 5 or 6 years with no one using it and nothing being done with the boat. So it was just sitting there rotting away, and this transom that was all trashed was just getting worse and worse and worse. And so that's how I got the boat for $1,000. Being in the boat for $1,000, then it comes to breaking it down in the work that needs to be done. You know, every boat is different, and so it really depends on your skill set, the tools, what you have available, and the work that you're willing to put into it. Now, when I break this down into the time factor and how much time I had in it, I want to say I had 156 hours total in the boat, being the entire restoration project itself. It might have been a little bit more, I'm sure it was, but as I've calculated, it's right around 156. And the major components that had to be fixed is going to be that transom, the fuel tank, the entire rewiring of the whole boat. All the rigging like this had to come out of the boat, and then all new rigging put into the boat, and I included all the wiring and everything. So from the batteries to the battery cables to the battery switches, all the electronics and all the wiring was all new when it went into the boat. If we start from the top of the projects that I took on, the first thing that I did was I completely ripped everything out of the boat. So that way I could start on the transom and get the fuel tank out of the boat. It was a custom tank, so I needed to get the tank out to give it to the welder in order for the welder to start working on it. So that way, once I was done with the transom and everything else, I could easily just pop the tank in and move on to the next project. Now, one of the interesting things about the rigging in this boat is because it was all old and it was all trash. So I pulled everything out, and I wasn't going to reuse anything as far as the electronics and the wiring. The Yamaha stuff that was in there, because it came with a Yamaha engine on it, that stuff I kept because I was going to put that into another boat. And that kind of goes into the price that we're going to talk about in a little bit of buying an engine and buying all the rigging that goes to the engine. So when you do project boats and restorations like this, acquiring the rigging, the engine, and those kinds of things can really change the price dramatically based on what you're going to put in it and what you've got on hand. For me, I do this more often than a lot of people, so I've got kind of a stockpile of stuff already stocked up. So I really have the rigging already covered. Now, the engine that I put into this boat, I got from another project boat. So I had all the rigging and I had the engine from a different boat. Going back to what we were talking about though, staying on topic, the transom was the first thing that I wanted to do. So I ripped everything out of the boat, and that took me about 8 hours to get all the rigging out of the boat. Then when it came to the demo portion and tearing out the transom, getting the fuel tank out of the boat, I took about 24 hours to completely tear out the transom and get the whole back of the boat completely emptied in order to start the fiberglass process of redoing the transom. Now the rebuild though, when it came to the glass work, that actually took one of the more time consuming processes of a restoration. I actually spent probably around 40 hours from fitting the Cusa, getting all the glass ready, putting the Coosa in, glassing it all together, and then fairing everything out and spraying the gel coat, that was about a full week of 8-hour days. So look at it as a 40-hour process to re-glass that transom and put it all back together, as well as fix the hatch that goes to over the fuel tank that we put back in the boat. Now the cost of everything for the transom, I use sheets of Coosa, and Coosa back then, I did this about 3 years ago, and the Coosa back then, the cost for the glass, the Coosa, the resin, the epoxy, the paint, everything was right around $2,500. So that puts us $2,500 in and roughly 66 hours of labor into the boat so far. Now our fuel tank though, that actually, usually a fuel tank, a custom tank from a welder, costs you around $10 a gallon. And the tank that went in is about a 165 gallon tank. That came out to be about $1,650 for our fuel tank. You know, it was about 8 hours to rip the tank out because the deck was so bad and it was so foamed in that it took a lot of effort to dig that tank out and get all the hoses, get all that stuff out from the boat. So we were 8 hours in pulling the tank out, and then we were another 8 hours of installing the tank, running the new fuel lines, the vent lines, the pickup tubes, the sender, and the wiring that goes to the sender. So that brings us to about 88 hours of labor getting the transom done and putting the fuel tank back in the boat. Our total cost at this point in time was $2,500 for the transom and $1,650 for the fuel tank. Give another $350 and bring that up to an even $2,000 because of the fill hose, the pickup hoses, the fuel sender, and the miscellaneous hose clamps and wiring to the fuel sender. So we're right at about $4,500 with the transom and the fuel tank completely done. Which brings us to our bracket situation, and we picked up our bracket that we put on the boat off of, I can't remember if I got it off Craigslist or Marketplace. So I picked up the bracket locally for $450. Now we were probably about 12 hours in the bracket. So from the time of picking the bracket up, putting it up to the boat, measuring everything out, getting our template set up, drilling all the holes, filling all the holes so that way they were all sealed so they wouldn't leak, then taping everything off and sealing the bracket and mounting it to the boat was about a 12-hour process, just over a day. Once the bracket was on the boat, then it was time to put the engine on. The engine, it took us about 2 hours to put the engine on, just hanging 4 bolts, not a big deal. That did not take much time at all. Getting all the rigging in the boat though, that actually took about 8 hours. That was about a full day from installing the power steering pump, the 14 pins, the battery cables, running everything to the back, the rigging tube, steering hoses, and getting everything rigged on the engine. That was pretty much a full day in just the rigging. Drilling out the key switch, mounting the key switch in there. So getting the engine done and getting all the rigging onto the boat, that was probably about a 12-hour process. One day in all the rigging, couple hours in putting the engine on. I mean, we could really say that it was just 10 hours, but actually it's more like 14 because I think I had 12 hours in the rigging. Bad float switch on an FSM. A lot of people know about these. Trash. When it comes to the price of the engine and the rigging though, I actually didn't have anything in that engine or in the rigging. All of the rigging I pulled from another boat that I did, that I made a video about. It was a 1985 Pursuit, had a 300 Yamaha on, or had a 300 Verado on the back of the boat. I took the Verado off and I sold that engine, which paid for the entire the whole boat. So I paid $3,500 for the boat. I took the engine off, sold the engine for $3,500. So that was a completely free boat and I had nothing in the boat. I took all the rigging for that Verado out of that boat and I saved it because I wanted to put it into this boat. And then the engine I actually picked up, same deal. I did a couple side jobs, did a couple things, and was able to acquire that engine, which again, in my situation, it's a little bit different than a lot of other people's where you are trying to restore a boat and you've got to acquire these things, but you're not really buying and selling and actually getting these items from other projects. So if you were to want to buy an engine and all the rigging, you could probably find a 300, because that's what we put on there. We put a 300 Verado on the boat that's there now, that's on there now. I would say you could probably pick one of those up for, I don't know, today you might find them for 5, 6, 7 grand, somewhere in there, depending on how bad it is. That engine has, I think now, about 2,500 hours on it. So it's probably a $5,000 to $7,000 engine if you were to find one today. Now, as far as finding the steering pump and the 14 pins, the key switches, the CCM harnesses, and all the rigging that goes in the boat, now that's going to probably set you back about $4,000, $5,000. So if we were to pay for all that stuff, we'd probably be in it for 10 to 12 grand in the engine and the rigging. Now, in this situation for this boat, I wasn't in it. I didn't put out the money to purchase that stuff, but I put in the work to acquire it and get it from somewhere else. So let's just say it's 11 grand, just to say it. So that brings us up to 4,500 for the transom and the fuel tank. Then we got 450 for our bracket, and then 11 grand for our engine and the rigging to the engine. That brings our total up to $15,950. But now is when we start talking about all the electronics and the rigging that got put into the boat. The cushions, I got a cushion made. That was $300. I got a T-top canvas made. I think I paid $400 for the T-top canvas. Now, the work that it took to put the T-top canvas in and string it, that was about 4 hours that I spent cleaning the T-top, and then about an hour to put that canvas on and restring it. So let's add another 5 hours of labor onto our total labor. Then we put bottom paint on the boat. The bottom paint costs about $400, and that took about 3 hours, 4 hours to take the boat off and paint it and all that stuff. So now we're up there around 17 grand, maybe a little bit more total in the boat. But with that kind of money, now you've actually got a usable boat, minus all the electronics and wiring that you got to put into it. We haven't paid for batteries, battery boxes, or all that stuff. So all of those electronics that I got, most of that stuff I got from either Land and Sea, either I had it, or I bought some stuff from West Marine, Port Supply. I got a lot of it from eBay, actually. A lot of the pumps and lights and stuff like that I got from eBay. I got some of the stuff from Amazon. So let's go ahead and go over that list of all the stuff that got put into the boat. On the time factor of it, the entire electrical side of putting all the wires in, the batteries, running the wiring and everything, I think that was about a 40-hour deal. So, you know, basically a full week, 8-hour days, 5 days. It's about 40 hours to completely rewire the boat, install all the spreader lights, anchor lights, nav lights, the fuse panels, the breaker, you know, just all of the electrical components that went into the boat, which is what brings our total hours up to 156 hours of labor. Now, when it comes to the cost of everything, I laid it all out on a spreadsheet here to kind of go through all the components. A lot of the stuff I did get from eBay and Amazon, like I was saying. Just to kind of give you a reference, here's $16.26 for that GPS cover. Here's the courtesy lights for $11. The amp, which was probably the more expensive component that we put on the boat, that was $700 for that M700 zip ties. The sub was only $210. The M3 is a little bit lower class than the M6 JL sub, but still a good sub. Some zip tie clamps or some zip tie holders for $6. Bilge pump, $100. Heat shrink butt connectors, $11. $25 for the nav lights. I got a Shakespeare AM FM VHF Marine Band separator, $50. So that way I could use one antenna for both the radio and for the VHF. Got the freshwater pump for $100. I bought the GPS used for $520. And then a couple things off Amazon, like this freshwater tank. It was for an RV tank. Got that off Amazon for $60. Got the orange wire
for $23.50. And then there was some other stuff that I didn't have that I got from Port Supply, West Marine, Land and Sea, and other places, like the JL speakers. Those were $600. The 2 batteries that I put in there, they were $200 a piece. The battery cables, I bought 2 rolls of 2 gauge, both black and red. I don't know if I bought a 25-foot roll or a 50-foot roll. I think I bought a 50-foot roll of each. So that was $300. I think I got a 500-foot roll of 14.2 Romex. That was $200. The radio head unit itself was $450, and then the VHF radio was $175. The Sea Blaze underwater lights that I put on there, those were $350 a piece, but I already had those, so I didn't have to pay for those. That brings our total in all of our electronics, the wiring, and all the components that we put in the boat to $4,888.72. You could probably just round that up to $5,000 whenever you include all the other miscellaneous things. This is going to put our total cost so far for the transom, the fuel tank, the bracket, the engine rigging, the T-top canvas, the cushions, the bottom paint, and the electrical wiring to $21,700. And you could probably just bring that up to $22,000 for all the miscellaneous things like the 5200, the 4200, the sealants, the different hatches that I put in, and miscellaneous starboard pieces, screws, stuff like that. So really, we're about $22,000 in this boat for a 1992 23-foot boat. I haven't really looked at boats lately and what the cost is because everything is so astronomically high. It's almost ridiculous. I've seen, like our boat here was a 23-footer we got for $1,000. It came with an engine. It needed a transom. It needed a fuel tank. It needed completely rewired. And I'm seeing boats now like a 21-foot Mako with no engine, needs a transom, needs a fuel tank, has no wiring in the boat, and these people want $10,000 for the boat. It's just insane. So what this boat is worth, I don't know, maybe $25,000, $30,000 for a 1992 restored boat.